The title of my talk is Civil Liberty as a Test of Politics, James P. Cannon, James Burnham, and Hal Draper on Liberal Socialism versus Democratic Statism. After the January 6th entry of pro-Trump protesters into the US Capitol building, as Glenn Greenwald appeared on Tucker Carlson to decry the Biden administration's new war on terror, the left's commitment to civil liberties could be described as wavering. Young leftists could be forgiven for believing that civil liberties and free speech are left-wing issues only insofar as they advance the causes of economic redistribution and/or identitarian inclusion, for this is the lesson frequently taught by today's academic and activist left. If civil liberties and free speech are not dismissed outright as inherently right-wing issues. In this presentation, I aim to show how civil liberties and free speech figured in the thought of the American Trotskyists James P. Cannon, James Burnham, and Hal Draper. I claim that these three thinkers preserve the historical memory and political logic of Second International Marxism in its struggle for a liberal or civil libertarian socialism during an era when that struggle had been definitively eclipsed on the American and international left by the Bonapartist politics of democratic statism, a politics which in the US took the form of the New Deal Democratic Party. I thereby hope to clarify what a Marxist approach to civil liberties has meant historically and could perhaps yet mean. The term liberal democracy, writes Helena Rosenblatt, would have seemed self-contradictory to most liberals in the 19th century. As the bourgeois revolution gave way to the industrial, as proletarian citizens without property turned to the state to address their inability to live by labor in society, and as an organized working class movement for socialism failed to achieve governing power, it was Louis Napoleon of France whose election and subsequent coup d'etat to save suffrage epitomized the politics of illiberal democracy under capitalism. Napoleon III's government seemed to constitute a new and hybrid type of rule, Rosenblatt writes, popular but authoritarian, both a police state and a welfare state. While the emperor used censorship and surveillance to stifle any opposition, he offered workers an unprecedented range of relief measures: soup kitchens, price controls on bread, insurance schemes, retirement plans, orphanages, nurseries, hospitals, tax relief, and grants to developers willing to build inexpensive housing. All of it was widely reported in the state-controlled press. Caesarism or Bonapartism became the name for a modern form of democratic dictatorship. Some socialists, Rosenblatt notes, praised Napoleon III for his Caesarism. Some liberals thought that being liberal meant working with the emperor to introduce reforms like individual rights and a free press. Other liberals opposed Napoleon III's Caesarism as an ancient form of tyranny, counterposing their liberalism to his democracy. Marx upheld liberalism and democracy from a socialist perspective. For Marx, it was industrial capitalism that had thrust the working class into the vanguard of the democratic revolution in 1848. Marx did not trust the state, however, that laid the workers low with grapeshot to secure their bourgeois rights to employment and civil liberties. Bonapartism for Marx indicated that only a new proletarian state, which dictated social production, could address the mass bourgeois democratic discontents that had driven Louis Napoleon's rise, while simultaneously securing the civil liberties his regime had trampled. Marx's critique of the convergence of socialism and liberalism with Bonapartism informed Second International Marxists whose mass political parties championed civil liberties. Vernon Littke writes that social democrats under Bismarck's regime assumed the responsibility of pushing forward the principles of liberalism while the liberal parties themselves had weakened in that task. This spirit underwrote the planks of free press, association, assembly, and expression written into the Gotha and Erfurt programs. In her 1900 polemic against Edward Bernstein's revisionism, Rosa Luxemburg listed Napoleon III among many examples of the abandonment by bourgeois society of the democratic conquests one up to now. Eugene Debs and Jean Jaurès have been accurately portrayed as citizen socialists committed to, quote, the bourgeois ideals of individual liberty, the republic, and the spirit of 1776 and 89. Yet one Cold War study, the same study, counterposes them to their presumably illiberal contemporaries like Lenin. More recent writings have recovered quote-unquote Lenin's liberalism, referring to the centrality of multi-party politics and the non-identity of party and state in Lenin's thought, alongside Lenin's electoral strategy of winning the battle of democracy. Lenin called for all-sided political agitation to take up every liberal question of rights and liberties in a 1902 polemic against social democrats who took a quote-unquote class point of view, arguing that these social democrats' indifference to liberalism revealed their ignorance of Marxism. Lenin cited the Dreyfus affair as a case in point. When Jaurès threw himself into a multi-party campaign for Dreyfus's right to a fair trial, socialists such as Jules Guesde argued that this was a distraction from the class struggle, since Dreyfus was a bourgeois and a military officer. Lenin, Luxemburg, and Debs sided with Jaurès in taking up Dreyfus's case, as did their teacher of Marxism, Karl Kautsky. They each viewed the class struggle not in sociological or economist terms, but ultimately in the political terms of the Socialist Party struggle for proletarian governing power. In this country, that struggle's historic height was reached by Debs's Socialist Party of America. This prompted American Bonapartism to likewise reach a new height when the administration of Woodrow Wilson launched a regime of terror and repression against the anti-war socialists. This history is well documented in Eric Chester's recent book, Free Speech and the Suppression of Dissent During World War I. With the integration of the Second International Parties into capitalist state governance circa 1914 onwards, with the failure of the World Revolution circa 1917 to 23, and with the Stalinization of the Third International circa 1927 onwards, Leon Trotsky's left opposition was among the few sections of the American and international left to remain ostensibly oppositional while retaining Second International Marxism's liberal approach to civil liberties. From this vantage point, Trotsky identified Stalinized communism as a historically new source of Bonapartism. In 1938, Trotsky argued that a victorious proletariat, quote, may find itself forced for a period of time to take special measures against the bourgeoisie, if the bourgeoisie adopts an attitude of open revolt against the worker state. Trotsky analogized this political situation to that of Abraham Lincoln during the US Civil War. Yet Trotsky continued, if these exceptional measures are prolonged long enough to create a permanent situation, then they carry the danger of giving a political monopoly to the workers' bureaucracy. Trotsky described the Soviet Union, with its hated suppression of the freedom of expression and of the press, as a living example of this. There, he wrote, the highly Bonapartist Moscow bureaucracy formed a new caste which stifled the workers' and peasants' opposition. Trotsky continued, the real tasks of the workers' state do not consist in policing public opinion, but in freeing it from the yoke of capital. This can only be done by placing the means of production, which includes the production of information, in the hands of society in its entirety. Once this essential step towards socialism has been taken, all currents of opinion which have not taken arms against the dictatorship of the proletariat must be able to express themselves freely. It is the duty of the workers' state to put in their hands, to all according to their numeric importance, the technical means necessary for this, printing presses, paper, means of transportation. One of the principal causes of the degeneration of the state machine is the monopolization of the press by the Stalinist bureaucracy, which risks to transform all the gains of the October Revolution to a pile of ruins. Trotsky viewed the campaign of a Mexican trade union leader for Mexican state censorship of the reactionary press as a symptom of Stalinist Bonapartism's influence on the international working class, describing labor supporters of the campaign as incurable Democrats. Trotsky applied the same logic to the United States. In a 1939 article justifying his agreement to appear before the House Un-American Activities Committee headed by Texas Democrat and New Dealer Martin Dies, Trotsky argued against state suppression of fascists and communists. As reactionaries, fascists could simply change color and adapt themselves to any kind of organizational form, and would gain ruling class sympathy and state support during times of crisis, no matter the laws passed against them. Suppressing communists would simply rehabilitate their crumbling reputations as persecuted fighters against the ruling classes. More importantly, state suppression would inevitably bear down on the working class's most advanced elements. Therefore, Trotsky concluded, the working class must stand in defense of freedom for all political tendencies, including their own irreconcilable enemies. James Buchanan, James Burnham, and Hal Draper were members of the same Trotskyist organizations for only 5 years between 1935 and 40. Burnham joined Max Shachtman in leading a Stalinophobic 1940 exodus of cadres out of the Socialist Workers' Party, or SWP, refusing to call for the military defense of the Soviet Union in war. Burnham soon abandoned Marxism altogether. He became a post-war anti-communist and later a conservative, co-founding National Review in 1955. Buchanan continued to lead the SWP through the 1960s. During the 70s, the SWP took a Stalinophilic turn and embraced the illiberal regime of the Cuban Communist Party. Draper followed Shachtman out of the SWP and into the Third Camp Workers' Party and subsequent Independent Socialist League. During the 1960s, when Shachtman pursued a strategy of realigning the Democratic Party, Draper broke with him to found the Independent Socialists and served as a mentor to the free speech movement. Despite these divergences of political trajectory, the following examination of writings by Cannon, Burnham, and Draper, spanning from the 30s to the 60s, reveals a common attempt to reinscribe a liberal or civil libertarian socialism in the face of political Bonapartism. In two 1931 editorials for The Militant, James P. Cannon criticized third period Stalinism for abandoning the fight for civil liberties. The city of Minneapolis had prohibited and broken up radical meetings. Following the undergroundist political logic of their third period, the Stalinists accepted the situation as a proof that there is no free speech, which they consider a point in their favor. The Trotskyists had a different idea. They held that free speech should not be surrendered to the logic that there is no justice under capitalism. They called for setting into motion a wide movement, including joint action with the Stalinists and a broad free speech conference to draw in and support the rights of trade unions and other organizations. Like Lenin's Bolsheviks under Kerensky, Cannon concluded, American communists should, quote, insist upon free and open discussions of all questions and points of view in order that the workers may judge fairly for themselves. They should become the champions of free discussion. James Burnham criticized the Stalinist subsequent Popular Front strategy of entering coalition governments with capitalist parties. This strategy was premised on the false dichotomy of bourgeois democracy versus fascism, Burnham argued. Hitler took power within the framework of the Weimar Constitution without any social revolution or even any basic transfer of power away from the ruling class of German finance capital. Bourgeois democracy and fascism were two forms of capitalist rule for Burnham, between which the ruling class could alternate as political necessity required. The ruling class understood this with greater clear-eyed objectivity than did most working class leaders, Burnham noted. He quoted a 1932 private bulletin of the Union of German Industry, which argued that a liberal policy of capitalist rule required social democracy to divide the working class and bind it to the state via material gains. Once the Depression rendered these gains impossible, the working class could only be divided and bound to the state via National Socialism with its violently illiberal policy. This meant that while the working class had no interest in the capitalist state, it had a clear interest in civil liberties. For Burnham, civil liberties were a means to socialism. Free speech served the defense of a revolutionary and labor press. Free assembly served the defense of the right of proletarian mass meetings. Habeas corpus furnished a legalistic weapon in the aid of class struggle prisoners. Significantly, civil liberties were also ends in themselves as features of socialism. Part of the historical aim of the proletariat is, Burnham wrote, to deepen and extend them as part of the structure of the true and genuine democracy of a classless society. Whereas the People's Front echoed liberal capitalist propaganda by conflating the defense of civil liberties with the defense of the bourgeois state, civil liberties needed to be defended against the bourgeois democratic state, for which they had become merely a pleasant social luxury so long as capitalism as a whole is vigorous and expanding. With proletarian leadership seeking to organize mass unrest, it was precisely the democratic state administered by social democratic majorities, labor governments, or People's Front governments, which restricted civil liberties under anti-fascist auspices. This presented a strategic opening. Socialists could take the lead in organizing against these restrictions. Trotsky's United Front strategy had called for joint action on specific issues between programmatically independent parties and organizations. The defense of civil liberties presented, quote, one of the most fruitful of all fields for the application of a genuine United Front tactic, offering a sought-after approach to the middle classes, which is in no sense capitulation, end quote. In his wartime writings, Cannon described a Trotskyist movement bearing the brunt of Bonapartism. Despite FDR's inclusion of freedom of speech among his four freedoms, the militant found its issues grounded or destroyed by the post office for criticizing the administration. Cannon himself was tried for sedition under the Smith Act, which criminalized ideas advocating forcible overthrow of the government. Cannon played Debs to FDR's Wilson. Cannon wrote, Roosevelt takes up where Wilson left off. Attorney General Biddle, with his raids and prosecutions, imitates Attorney General Palmer. Postmaster General Walker suppresses socialist and labor papers like his Democratic predecessor Burleson. OWI head Davis suppresses the news of our suppression like Propaganda Minister Creel during the last war. Like Debs, Cannon used his trial as an opportunity to champion the Bill of Rights. He articulated a socialist path to power analogous to the US Civil War, in which the abolitionist Republican Party won a Democratic electoral majority and only thereby prompted a reactionary revolt. After breaking with Trotskyism in 1940, Burnham turned to liberal sociology to ground a critique of FDR's Bonapartism in his 1943 book, The Machiavellians, Defenders of Freedom. At the dawn of the bourgeois revolution, Machiavelli had counseled distrust of the ruling class and the subordination of officials to the law. Burnham now posited that another social revolution had taken place between 1900 and 1940, the Managerial Revolution, carrying a new elite to power across the world. Vilfredo Pareto's concept of the circulation of elites described the process by which upper and middle managerial elite ranks were filled based on merit rather than birth. Democracy, in Gaetano Mosca's sociological sense of the term, referred to the degree of this elite circulation, while liberty, especially civil liberties protecting the rights of political opposition, facilitated this elite circulation. Yet this democratic circulation of elites, vital to the health of any society, carried an illiberal risk, especially in cases such as Tsarist Russia and Weimar Germany, where a national or global aristocratic tendency blocked the democratic integration of new constituencies via the oligarchic elites who managed them. These new managers, when they finally took power, were prone to establishing themselves as a new aristocracy and to abrogating civil liberties for all who opposed them. Burnham described this illiberal democratic tendency, often tied to plebiscitary executive power, as Bonapartism. Hitler and Stalin were the quintessence of Bonapartism for Burnham, whereas FDR differed from them considerably in degree, but not in kind. Burnham described Vice President Henry Wallace as, quote, the major prophet in this country of the Bonapartist mystique, and paraphrased a speech Wallace delivered at a communist-organized event as follows. Burnham writes, Wallace's goal, in common with Russia's, is, quote, the new democracy, the democracy of the common man. This new democracy, quote, includes not only the Bill of Rights, but also economic democracy, ethnic democracy, educational democracy, and democracy in the treatment of the sexes, end quote, all of which must be woven together into a harmonious whole. Of these 5 types, Wallace finds Russia today to be far superior in 4, all but Bill of Rights democracy. Let us not imagine that this is a Russian defect in Wallace's mind. Quote, some in the United States, and the context makes clear that Wallace numbers himself among them, believe that we have overemphasized what might be called political or Bill of Rights democracy. Carried to its extreme form, it leads to rugged individualism, exploitation, impractical emphasis on states' rights, and even to anarchy. Burnham complained of the rapidly growing number of democratic totalitarians of Wallace's ilk, ranging from pathological newspapers, frustrated poets, and choleric bureaucrats to guilt-ridden bankers' sons and ministers, all advocating the suppression of, quote, the specific rights and freedoms that still protect the individual from the advance of the unbridled state. With Hitler's rise to power in mind, Burnham quoted Huey Long to the effect that if fascism destroys democracy in this country, it will do so in the name of democracy. Those who opposed this outcome needed to safeguard above all the right of opposition, the right of opponents of the currently governing elite to express publicly their opposition views and to organize to implement those views, end quote. Any meaningful political opposition, in turn, would require the existence of social forces independent of the centralized state, as the Soviet Union's fate made clear. Articulating a non-Marxist socialism, Burnham held that liberty did not require private property in the means of production. Freedom could be consistent with its abolition if the state were decentralized or if economic forces were divided along functional or syndicalist lines. Draper likewise upheld civil liberties in a 1950 piece titled The Socialist View, Democracy is a Weapon. The United States arose, quote, out of a mass revolutionary struggle that had implanted deep roots of democratic feeling, Draper observed, but these roots were being overgrown by a totalitarian culture of fear. Fear not of being sent to a slave camp or a prison, as in the Soviet Union, but the more American-style fear of, quote, being suspected of thinking dangerous thoughts, fear of being suspected of associating with people who are suspected of thinking dangerous thoughts, fear of losing a job, fear of being avoided by your friends, fear of bad publicity, fear of losing clients. Draper traced this culture of fear to the bureaucratic state. Truman's sprawling intelligence agencies placed gumshoes in the factories and pressed charges based on guilt by association. Woodrow Wilson, Draper suggested, supplied the historical precedent. In the face of this Cold War against social liberties, Americans for Democratic Action exemplified the full retreat beaten by the country's liberal spokesmen and labor leaders, who only opposed McCarthy's attacks because these attacks targeted the Truman administration itself, to which the liberal labor circles were bound by practical political considerations. This amounted to a liberal betrayal of liberalism. If there's one thing that has distinguished liberalism at its best, Draper wrote, it has been its firmness in taking a determined stand in defense of all forms of freedom for the expression of ideas. Draper took this liberalism to be essential to any truly socialist society. In the economic field, civil liberties would protect a factory manager's ability to take initiative from below without fearing charges of insubordination from state bureaucrats above. In the political realm, civil liberties would serve as a check against a new ruling class of state bureaucrats who own the means of production. And in cultural life, civil liberties would safeguard, quote, the remaking of man himself. Cannon upheld a similar view during the Cold War years. He cautioned against defining American fascism too formalistically by the European pattern, for this limited fascism to violence practiced by stormtroopers outside the law. How then to account for, quote, violence which is technically illegal and unconstitutional, but carried out by duly constituted officials clothed with legal authority, supported by press campaigns and radio demagogues. Cannon argued that this latter kind of violence comprised, quote, the specific form which American fascism will take, citing Trotsky's classification of New Jersey Democratic Party Mayor Frank Hague as a fascist. Hague's police violated free speech and free assembly without any need for unofficial shirted hooligans. In 1960, when New York Democratic Party Mayor Robert Wagner denied American Nazis a meeting permit, citing fears of anti-Nazi violence, Cannon described this apparent victory as, quote, certainly not a victory for the right of free speech and assembly as guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, to which we are firmly and I hope sincerely devoted. Socialism's fight against fascism, Cannon held, will not be a fight to deprive the fascists of the right to speak and meet, but rather a defensive fight, and not only with words, to prevent them from interfering with the rights of the workers, end quote. The party line was free speech. In a 1968 article titled Free Speech and Political Struggle, Draper identified the logic underlying Cold War Social Democrats' retreat from civil liberties, the quote-unquote hierarchy of values. This line of illiberal apologetics found its spokesman in Sidney Hook, who explained that while he was for every exercise of free speech, there were some, like the communists, who wanted to use free speech to destroy freedom and democracy. Such persons could be deprived of free speech and civil liberties, Hook argued, without impugning the higher value of liberty itself. The methodological model for this argument was supplied during the 1930s and 40s, Draper recalled, when the liberal and radical imaginations converged in a belief that the Nazis had taken power because, quote, Weimar Germany let them enjoy the benefits of free speech and democratic rights. This historical narrative, Draper argued, was wholly false. Draper wrote, it is simply not true that the truly scandalous behavior of the courts in Weimar Germany revolved around free speech for Nazis cases. The judges of this very democratic republic were letting Nazi thugs go scot-free, even in cases where they had been caught red-handed in murder, assault, beatings of Jews and radicals, breaking up of trade union headquarters, and similar actions. Action, not speech. If the Nazi movement had confined itself to speeches, including fascist speeches, it would never have been the danger it was. No rights to free speech had to be curtailed by a millimeter in order to have had an abundance of grounds for rounding up the entire Nazi leadership years before they became even a clear and present danger. Actions, not speech. This is the key. Draper's free speech and political struggle was only incidentally directed against the illiberalism of Cold War social democrats, however. Its main target was the illiberalism of student radicals. In 1966 and 67, when militant anti-war demonstrations demanded that the Berkeley administration cease to provide Dow recruiters with special university facilities, the most disconcerting development of all for Draper was the fact that many student militants agreed with the administration that the demonstrations violated Dow's free speech, but concluded that it was a good thing to violate the right of free speech in such a good cause. It was not Sidney Hook whose ideas licensed this hierarchy of values redux, but Herbert Marcuse. Draper wrote, in the book A Critique of Pure Tolerance, Marcuse condemns freedom of speech, tolerance of it anyway, for those whose views are antithetical to him, and advocates an educational dictatorship of enlightened intellectuals like himself, who know they are right and everybody else is wrong. He does this with only a smidgen of Hegelianized double talk. This amounted for Draper to a new left reinvention of, quote, the unwritten program of any of the communist parties. Draper therefore understood Marcuse's popularity among university students to reflect the aspirations of a rising bureaucratic intelligentsia to, quote, a new ruling class dictatorship of their own benevolent despotism. Draper concluded that only a politically conscious mass movement committed to civil liberties and to distrust of the bourgeois state could lead to a free socialist society and to a genuinely socialist civil libertarian state.
Hey, Ed, really sorry to interrupt, but I think we need to wrap up in the next few minutes so we can move to the response and then the next presentation. So if you can wrap up in the next minute or so, that'd be great.
Okay, good.
Sorry.
Yeah. Draper covered the centrality of Bonapartism to Marxist politics in the first volume of his 5-volume masterwork, Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution. There, as a codex to the lessons drawn by organized Trotskyism during the New Deal era, Draper listed FDR alongside Bismarck as Napoleon III's political heirs. Both men, Draper noted, manifested the tendency toward state autonomy that pitched the swindle of democratic statism above and against society, menacing the civil liberties of worker and bourgeois alike. In his rightward turn, Burnham remained critical of Bonapartist developments in American politics, yet where Bonapartism served for Marx as a critical phenomenon which negatively revealed the possibility of the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat as the task of human freedom and capitalism, Bonapartism became for Burnham simply a trans-historical form of unfreedom to be eternally opposed. Ironically, while abandoning the struggle for proletarian socialism as hopelessly utopian, Burnham embraced the horizons of elite managerial circulation common to the redistributionist and identitarian strains of contemporary progressive politics. Hal Draper described free speech as a test of politics. A commitment to free speech and civil liberties served as a test of politics not only in Draper's thought, but also in the thought of James Burnham through 1943 and in the thought of James P. Cannon through the 1960s. If their liberal socialism is taken to mark the historic horizons of the political left, then the charge of illiberal leftism leveled by today's avowed political right becomes a contradiction in terms. From a historically Marxist perspective, the contemporary left has not become illiberal. Rather, insofar as any ostensible left becomes illiberal, it is in that respect no longer the left at all. That's it.
Great, thank you so much, Ed. Okay, Brian, take it away with any comments or questions that you might have for Ed.
Good. So Ed, thank you for this very instructive reminder that the Marxist left was actually interested in civil liberties. The infantile left on college campuses these days seems to have forgotten that. So it is a good reminder. And I think the crucial thought for the Marxist left comes from, you may not have actually read this because I know you shortened the paper, but this is from page 8 of the manuscript where you're discussing Burnham. And I think Burnham puts it very well. That is, civil liberties were a means to socialism. Free speech served the defense of a revolutionary and labor press. Free assembly served the defense of the right of proletarian mass meetings. Habeas corpus furnished a legalistic weapon in the aid of class struggle prisoners. And I do think that is the crucial thought, right? In the absence of civil liberties, the people who will lose them first will not be Tucker Carlson. They will not be Matt Gaetz. They will not be Chuck Schumer. They will, however, be those who are opposed to the capitalist system. And so I think Burnham gets it basically right here. And this is part of the irony about Marcuse. I just want to say one quick thing about that and Draper's critique of Marcuse. You know, the funny thing about Marcuse was he was actually a Millian, quite explicitly in repressive tolerance. That is, the argument is predicated on the same set of assumptions that you find in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And a crucial thing about Mill's argument on liberty is that he says explicitly, right, that freedom of expression and thought and action and so on will not contribute to well-being if certain background conditions don't obtain. He says if people are in a state of nonage, he's referring to the Indian subcontinent in all likelihood, they're better off with a kind of benevolent tyranny, right? So certain background conditions have to obtain if free discussion is really to benefit people. Now, Marcuse's critique, and I think this, shouldn't be dismissed quite as rudely as Draper did. Marcuse's critique is that Mill hasn't really specified the background conditions under which free speech leads to human well-being very carefully. He assumes education and maturity. And Marcuse's view is that in capitalist America in the 1960s or in the 2020s, the population is far too indoctrinated, manipulated, and so on to actually benefit from free speech. That is, I think, the essence of Marcuse's view. The problem is, as was often the case with Marcuse, who, shall we say, didn't think too much about practicalities. The Jefferson Airplane did not produce the revolution. And I think that was about the only program he had. But what Marcuse didn't give attention to is exactly what Burnham points out, right? Which is that, yes, the population may be ideologically deluded in large part about both their interests and their historical situation. But the only way of breaking through, right, is if civil liberties are protected and the contrary point of view, including Marcuse's point of view, can be freely expressed. So I think it's an important lesson for the left to remember. And as I say, I found the paper very instructive in revealing the depth of left commitment. I was not actually familiar with Trotsky's remarks on this, so that was also especially interesting. Anyway, thank you for the paper, Ed.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it.
Yeah, Ed, if you want to respond or ask any questions of your own or anything like that, or if anyone else in the panel wants to chime in, feel free. I will just open this up to the general audience now as well. So I'll briefly explain how that works. We're going to do this at the beginning of every panel, but basically regular audience members can now submit written questions for the panelists with their Q&A tool, which you can open by clicking the button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And I'm going to moderate the Q&A and choose attendees to ask questions with their audio on. So far, we haven't gotten any, so we'll probably just move on to the next presentation if we don't get them, or there are no further submissions. But yeah.
Maybe just quickly one brief comment. Again,
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian, for reading the paper and for your comments. I appreciate them very much. I would say that, one interesting thing, comparing Burnham and Draper, right, is that Burnham, I think part of his right-wing turn is that he really takes the whole Second International project of organizing and educating the working class to necessarily end in this kind of oligarchic counter-revolution or integration with the state, right? And so that is a right-wing turn, I think, from the perspective of the history of Marxism. And I think what Draper very helpfully preserves is that while democracy was indeed a threat because it could lead to Bonapartist statism, right, it was also an opportunity to organize and educate the working class. And I think, because in the spirit of your comments, Brian, I'm reminded that Adorno makes kind of a similar comment. I'm forgetting exactly where, but that free speech today has, it's not necessarily the result of a free, educated society, right? Like the sort of opinions and perspectives being traded are very much those of minds being shaped by unfree conditions of capitalism. But the Second International project was really to educate the working class. And I think so they really, they would take that point, but they would say that's exactly what we're doing through our civil social institutions that are sort of independent of the state and sort of oppositional politically. And I think in the 20th century, in the course of the 20th century, that project essentially disintegrates. And so it becomes unfortunately plausible for people, even on the ostensible left, to no longer understand the rationale for a leftist defense of civil liberty and freedom of expression.
Yeah, Brian, if you want to respond, go ahead. But I see that Dylan also has his hand up. Feel free to jump in if you want, Dylan.
No response. I agree.
All right.
Thanks a lot for that. I thought it was a really pretty fascinating paper. But the one thing that I wanted to just maybe get you to reflect on a little bit is the position of the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, both in Marx's work, right? And obviously just the broader strategic problem that this raises. I mean, it strikes me that as obvious as these things can be, that all of the really great thinkers of, I would say both the Second and the Third International were committed to the idea, in some sense, of freedom of expression, as part of the development of a social society. But the question is, of course, the period of transition, which, in my understanding, would inevitably involve a violent struggle for control of the state apparatus, in which a suspension or violation of civil liberties, at least for some groups, would be an absolute necessity. And so what's sort of your view about that issue? Because that seems like quite an important issue. I mean, think about what Trotsky says in Terrorism and Communism. How does that fit in with his robust defense of civil liberties?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think, one I guess 2 points. One shorthand of the meaning of dictatorship in Dictatorship of the Proletariat, I think, is that it, as I try to briefly indicate in the paper, it essentially meant dictating social production, right? Sort of a hopefully potentially variegated, in that sense, liberal, right? System in which parties are distinct from the state, which are in turn distinct from unions and other civil social organizations, but in which social production can be consciously dictated by socialist politics, rather than now where it's sort of dictated by capitalism. And so I think that was the vision. I think you raise a point that gets to the heart of the issue with respect to Trotsky and the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution. I guess the way I would put that is that I think Trotsky was very conscious, and Lenin as well, that they were not sort of inventing, so to speak, the genres of revolution or of civil war, that in taking responsibility for the democratic reproduction of capitalism up to and including the task of assuming governing power, they were participating in political dynamics that had sort of their own historical logic, right? And so therefore they were very careful students of the history of revolution, including the French Revolution. Obviously, much of Trotsky's writing is informed by that, and even the U.S. Civil War. It's interesting that, for example, in Eric Chester's book On Debs and the Suppression of Free Speech during the First World War, Chester criticizes Lincoln for Lincoln's Bonapartism, which is also raised in Helena Rosenblatt's book, Lost History of Liberalism. So I think they had an understanding that to the extent that they failed to organize civil society for socialism, there would be a kind of reactionary counter-revolution that would lead to violence. I think at their best, they saw violence as a symptom of their failure to have organized and educated society. But they also, I think, understood it as something inherent in the political genre of their undertaking, right? And so, but it's interesting, Trotsky ends up saying, like, really, well, with the encirclement and failure, with the failure of the world revolution, with the encirclement of the Russian Revolution in backwater conditions, the bureaucratization of the party, the destruction of the old Bolsheviks, and really the dismantling of the working class, that really what you get is a hidden war. It's interesting. He describes Stalin as administering a hidden war. There is this war going on in the Soviet Union throughout Stalinization, but it's hidden under the facade of this seemingly sort of stable, stolid state apparatus, which, again, it's a very Bonapartist phenomenon, right? The idea of society being subject to a hidden war, but things sort of seem sort of stable and clear. And so, yeah, I think at his best, Trotsky recognized that that's what had happened. But I mean, certainly one can get into the weeds on, the actual October Revolution, and which certainly did not. I think Lenin was very cognizant of the fact that did not in any way live up to the expectations that they had for the outcome of the world revolution.
And I would have thought there was a simpler answer to Dylan's question, which is that, and again, it comes in what you say about Burnham, right? Civil liberties were a means to socialism. There's a certain point at which they aren't a means, right? And that, I think, is what all these thinkers thought. And the dictatorship of the proletariat. I don't think dictatorship means what you think it means. I think for Marx, it was specifically a reference to an established practice in ancient Rome, right, where in fact someone could assume dictatorial powers for short periods of time in order to deal with certain emergencies, right? But it was a short-lived thing. But I think it's fairly clear that under the dictatorship in the Roman sense, or in Marx's sense of the dictatorship of the proletariat, there would be some suspension of civil liberties, right? And one would hope that it would be short-lived. But since civil liberties are primarily viewed as a means, it's not surprising that there's a point when the means don't serve the end.
Yeah, and I think, Draper really tries to emphasize this, that the only way you're going to get a civil libertarian socialism is if you have a mass movement that's politically educated in the principles of civil liberty and in the practical exercise of those principles vis-a-vis the capitalist state. I think Draper really upholds to that vision most out of the thinkers I examined, where he really thinks that has to be built into it from the start, or else what you're going to get is not going to be any kind of emancipatory socialism.
I think I have a question. So you spoke a bit about how I think it was Second International Era socialist leaders would have seen themselves in conditions of what they thought of as the dictatorship of the proletariat, carrying out tasks that were sort of shaped by a broader historical process going on around them. Not just like exerting their will on reality, and that bears at least some resemblance in kind of way to the sort of permanent firefighting quality that Bonapartism has to it. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the relationship between this concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat and this concept of Bonapartism.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think there's certainly a strain. There's sort of an interpretation in which you could see the dictatorship as a kind of critical Bonapartism, right? That Marx is recognizing that this simply is the, recognizing that socialists aren't inventing this genre of civil war, right? Socialists aren't inventing this genre of political revolution. That Bonapartism, there is an inherent Bonapartist moment when in the context of despite your best efforts to organize and educate, a counter-revolutionary attempt to roll back your emancipatory project, a la the Confederacy in the United States, which is the historical example that Cannon uses. And so, right, there is an acknowledgement that there will be at least a moment of Bonapartism, that the dictatorship of the proletariat as this kind of transitional stage will in some sense be Bonapartist in the way that, for example, Lincoln or the Republican Party was Bonapartist. And so I think you're right, to point to that. Whereas, for example, that's why I mentioned both the mid-19th century liberals and Burnham, who returns to them in some sense, for example, who returns to Gaetano Mosca, they have what you could call an undialectical conception of Bonapartism, right? Because they simply say this is this form of ancient tyranny that you simply flatly oppose, right? And ironically, that pushes, like, the opposition to that ancient form of tyranny pushes him into the capitalist state. Essentially, like that's part of the political implication of that, is that then you join the part of the capitalist state that's more, Republican, if you will, against the faction of the capitalist state that's more Caesarist, right? So that's sort of an undialectical conception of Bonapartism. Whereas I think what you're pointing to is that the Second International Marxists recovered this sort of dialectical conception where they recognized that their project would take on a Bonapartist character at a certain point. I think that's a really good insight.